Hello and welcome back. This video we're looking at the top 15 injury bounce back candidates, guys who were injured last year and will get overlooked in the draft, but could be great options in the later rounds of the draft. Now this started out as a top 5, but there were simply too many good players that missed significant time last year that I had to expand the list. So sit back, soak in the data, and you can find diamonds in the rough this year in your fantasy draft looking at this data. So we're going to look at the criteria first. So what went into this? Fewer than 60 games played last season. Obviously, if a guy missed 10 or 15 games, that's not necessarily what we're looking for. Almost all of the players that you see here, in fact, all of them in the top 10 played fewer than 60 games last year. We're looking for a minimum rating of a 65 on the Data Draft Player Hub. This indicates a guy who's going to be fantasy relevant in a 12-team league. There will be some guys on the honorable mentions list that you can go for deeper league plays. And then obviously we don't want to include Cale Makar or Kirill Kaprizov. Both of those guys hovered around the 60-65 game range, but they're both going to be drafted super high, probably in the first round. Now, here are the criteria. I used all 4 of these categories and equally weighted them and created a score. And from that score, we get this list. So 5-year average rating, this represents how consistent the player is. A count of categories above the 90th percentile. So how many categories is this guy elite in? That's a good understanding of how elite the player is in general. Recent performance, the last 2 seasons, obviously last year their rating might have been off because of injury. We're looking at 21-22 as well. And then an injury history to kind of give us a sense of, okay, this guy was injured last year. Are they usually injured? And if they are, we kind of don't want to necessarily put them higher up in the list. But without any further ado, let's get into the honorable mentions, the 15 through 13. And we're going to start with Spencer Knight. I mentioned him in a previous video. He could be a waiver guy to start the season, but this is something to monitor because if you look at his 5-year rating trend, this was his rookie year, not bad at a 50. Then he bumps up to a 70, and he was kind of splitting time and sort of slowly winning the net over from Sergei Bobrovsky back in 21-22. And then last year fell off a cliff, lost the net, lost the backup job, and ultimately Alex Lyon had to come in and get them into the playoffs and then started the playoffs as well. So the reason why I have him on here is because of what I just said. Sergei Bobrovsky dropped the ball all season last year until they got into the playoffs, and once they were into the first round and they needed him to get over Boston, and then obviously he played incredibly well going on after that. But in the regular season, Bobrovsky is not that consistent in my opinion, and a guy like Spencer Knight is the young and up-and-coming goaltender that could be the 1A, 1B type of tandem situation that you don't really think of for Sergei Bobrovsky. You think of him as a starter. So this is something I'm monitoring. I'm not necessarily super high on it, but a lot of people forgot about Spencer Knight, so you want to keep him in the back of your mind just in case you get the opportunity to find him on the waiver wire. If you're doing the zero goalie strategy, this could come in handy as well. The next guy is Cam Atkinson and Sean Couturier, both of whom didn't play last year and both of whom should see time in the top 6 this year for Philadelphia. Now, you're looking at Atkinson's 5-year rating, incredibly consistent, 68, 67, 68, 67. He's going to be in that range if he's healthy. And then what you're looking at over here is the 21-22 player hub for Cam Atkinson. You see 93rd percentile in shots, almost 3 shots per game, 87th percentile in goals, 0.32 goals per game, so that's a goal every 3rd game. And then he gets a couple of other things. He gets some points. This is a relatively low point total for him in terms of what he's done in the past, but this is not bad. You're getting a goal scorer and a shooter with a little bit of other category coverage, some power play time. This should go up if he's in the top 6 in Philadelphia. And then we have Sean Couturier as well. And a couple of people were asking me about him. He used to be a very consistent player in terms of where he would go, 77, 74, 77. Then he started getting into some injury trouble. He dropped to a 70, and that was 21-22. So you'll notice this is a 5-year rating trend, but this is only 4 seasons for both of these guys. They didn't play last year. So you're looking at a guy who was trending in the wrong direction before missing the season last year, but he's finally healthy. That could be a really good opportunity to buy low on a guy. In a 12-team league, he might not be a draft candidate. He might be a waiver pickup. But if you're in a face-off league, I would definitely think of him a little bit higher. He's typically better in face-off coverage than a lot of other guys, and you just lost the best guy in the league in Patrice Bergeron, so now you're going to look for other options, guys who can win face-offs. Couturier could do that. He also shoots 90th percentile, a little bit better on the power play, and then relatively low in terms of point per game is only 0.6 essentially. But he is one of those guys that's going to have to be a complete center for Philadelphia. They're going to have to rely on him, and a lot of people forgot about both of these guys. So these could be some nice sleeper, deeper league plays if you're interested. But let's get into 12 and 11. We're going to do these combined. And these are two players that I've owned before and I've been really high on in the past. Josh Norris and Zach Werenski. We'll start with Norris. So Josh Norris in 21-22, 66 games, 35 goals, 20 assists, 55 points, plus 16, 23 power play points, 8 game-winning goals. And you can see he was covering everything, 98th percentile in goals per game. He was over half a goal per game, which is incredible. His power play production was off the charts, 95th percentile as well. And he was shooting a healthy amount, 87th percentile, 2.6 shots per game. And he does hit a little bit, 1.2 hits per game, 0.67 blocks per game, and that's sort of the Tkachuk effect. We saw that with Alex DeBrincat. DeBrincat was hitting around the same level last year. Guys who play on that team typically tend to hit a little bit more than they would have if they maybe were on another situation, another team or whatever. So he is getting a couple hits, a couple blocks, but incredible power play numbers. He's in the top 6 in that offense, which is obviously something you want access to. And you can see here, 74, 79, he was trending in the right direction, and then obviously got hurt last year, didn't play, so he fell off. So if you have him in the back of your mind, I would spend a draft pick on him because he is getting you access to that top 6. Could be Tarasenko, could be Batherson, Giroux, any of those guys that he's going to be playing with, you're going to want access to, and he's a pure goal scorer who can shoot and get it done on the power play. Now, speaking of power play and shooting, Zach Werenski, he was one of those guys. He was on my D core. He was my D3 last year. He was incredible for shot volume, 96th percentile, and he was getting a ton of blocks, 95th percentile, 1.85 blocks per game. Really good stuff from Zach Werenski. He was the #1 power play guy, and then he got hurt, and their entire season fell off a cliff. Now, even getting hurt, his 5-year rating trend is incredibly consistent, between a 70 and a 75 every season. Last year, he was a 73.5, so you're looking at a guy who's been relatively consistent over the last 5 years, who doesn't have a terrible injury history. He just got dinged up last year, cost him the season, and obviously he's going to want to bounce back from that. I think Provorov coming over doesn't affect his power play time as much as maybe you would think. He is a pure shooter. He does get power play points, 0.15 power play points per game, 76th percentile. He gets some assists, he gets some goals, and in fact, why you would own him, his goal production, his high is 20 goals over just a 63-game season in 1920. That's his peak in terms of his goal scoring potential. But almost every other year, he's been between 11 and 20 goals per season. So this is a guy that you can probably count on for 15 goals. You're going to get 3.15 shots per game and some blocks, some peripheral coverage. So this is a guy I would definitely like to own in a 12-team league as a D3, maybe a D4, depending on how many spots you have. But now let's get to the top 10. So on that same Ottawa Senators team with Josh Norris, Jakob Chychrun. Obviously, Chychrun has a lengthy injury history. He was sidelined with a lower body injury at the 2022 trade deadline, forced to sit out the final 24 games of the season. And then he was obviously delayed a little bit last year. He was sat out for 2 or 3 weeks, maybe more than that, while they were waiting to trade him. But why you would own him is you get really good assist coverage, 88th percentile. The shots are huge, 93rd percentile, 3 shots per game, 93rd percentile in blocks. So pretty similar to Zach Werenski in the fact that you're getting elite level shots and blocks coverage. You used to get some power play points, but only 1 last year. And this is maybe the reason why you wouldn't want to own him. 1 power play point last year, and he's probably not going to be the power play quarterback when you factor in Shabbat and Sanderson. Now, he is obviously skilled enough to do that, and it depends on what they want to do in terms of usage, because he is a guy that can quarterback a power play, but he didn't get it last year. If you look at his 5-year trend, his lows are about, right around the 70 range, and his highs are really impressive. An 84, that was 2 seasons ago. Then you have a 68, and then last year he was bumped up to an 80. So even though he was injured, he did play really well. 34 points in 48 games, 9 goals, 24 assists, really productive, getting the peripheral coverage. Obviously, the one thing you're going to look at is the 74.11% in terms of how many of his team's games has he played in over the last 5 years. That's what this signifies, and he's not playing a lot. So he's always injured. That is something to be concerned about, but if you're going to take a flyer on him in the later rounds, that could definitely pay off. He was ADP 168 last year, and if you can get him in that range again this year, that could be a money play. Not necessarily going to win you your league, but it could be a really good defenseman add at that point in the draft. Now up next, we have Andre Burakovsky, and another guy that probably flies under the radar because he missed some time last year, but the opposite is in effect here for Burakovsky. 93.3% of his team's games he's played in over the last 5 years, so he's not injury prone. He was just injured last year. So this is a guy, he lower body injury. He tore his groin last year, didn't play past February 7th because of that injury. But the head coach and GM Ron Francis expect him to be completely recovered in time for the start of next season. So why would you own him? Why would you want him? Power play 1 on a high scoring team, tons of power play points and assists. You can see 91st percentile in power play production, 0.3 power play points per game essentially. That's what you look for in terms of power play production. That 0.3 number is where you want to be. 91st percentile in assists, that's half an assist per game. Getting a decent amount of shots, over 2 shots per game, and his point totals are not bad either, 0.8 points per game. So relatively good offensive player, 14 power play points last year, including 3 game-winning goals. 39 points in 49 games is really good. And this team is stacked. They're very deep. He didn't see any time, again, after February 7th, so he didn't have access to that playoff run that they made, but this is still a guy that you're going to want to have access to because of the players he's playing with and because of the situation. Now, the cons to this file, they did have the second best team shooting percentage last year, and they may regress a little bit offensively because of that. So if that shooting percentage comes down a little bit, maybe they're not scoring closer to 4 goals per game, maybe it's a little bit closer to 3 goals per game, maybe that power play cools off just a little bit. That could be one thing to think about in terms of Burakovsky, but he's a guy that's flying under the radar. Last year, ADP 194. If he's anywhere near that range again, even in the 160 range, I would definitely take a shot on him later in the draft because he is relatively consistent in this high 60s range, although he has been trending down over the past couple of years, but that was obviously in Colorado and then coming over to Seattle. So hopefully, if you pick this guy up, he can get back to this form where he's 91st percentile in power play points and assists as well. Now, up next, we have a guy who's going to be a little bit more controversial, and this is a high-risk, high-reward play. Max Pacioretty, torn Achilles twice, extremely high injury risk, 72.84%, and it's well documented why you wouldn't want to own him because of that. He's maybe one more torn Achilles or anything related to that away from potentially having to hang him up. So this is an incredibly risky file, but there's a reason why he's on here so high. You'd own him because he's 99th percentile in goals per game. That is a small sample size, but if you look at last year, he was 96th percentile in 21-22, 99th percentile in shots, 3.79 shots per game, 93rd in power play production, 0.31 power play points per game, just under a point per game player. He does get a couple hits, couple blocks, but that's not why you're owning him. You're owning him for all of these elite categories. So when I talked about the count of categories above 90th percentile, this guy's got 4. So you're looking at point production, goals, shots, and power play production, and his assists aren't bad either when he's healthy. So obviously you know the cons, you know why you wouldn't draft him, and this is what happened. So he's above an 80 these 2 seasons in Vegas, comes over, these 3 seasons in Vegas, he was extremely productive. Then he comes over to Carolina, gets injured, but he was still productive in those 5 games. He had 3 goals in those 5 games. But obviously the previous season, 37 points in 39 games, 19 goals, 18 assists, and a bunch of those were on the power play as well. So this is a guy who, I wouldn't draft him in this range, this 117, but if you can get him a little bit later than that, probably towards the end of your draft. Last year, I picked him as my absolute last pick. I threw him on the IR, and then I picked up a guy off waivers, and that guy ended up being Dylan Larkin, who I held on to all season. So that's kind of the play that I would make this year with Pacioretty, because obviously it's extremely risky to draft him, but he does have an extremely high ceiling, and he's going to a Capitals team that could definitely use him in the top 6 for some goal-scoring punch. So hopefully he gets healthy. Hopefully he's in the lineup this year. And if he is, you might want to keep an eye on it just because of how elite he is in those 4 categories. But on his team this year, another guy that we're looking at is TJ Oshie. Now, Oshie's been plagued by injuries over the last couple seasons. He played just 44 games in 21-22 after dealing with a broken foot and upper body injuries. He missed 14 games this past season due to back troubles. He's got other bumps and bruises along the way, and he's also had core surgery over the offseason. So this is a quote from him. "Unfortunately, the rest of my career here, there's just going to be some times where I'm not going to be able to walk for a couple weeks, and that's the way she goes." So that's a little bit concerning, obviously, and so is his injury risk. 77.22% of his team's games over the last 5 years he's been a part of. But why you'd own him? So goal production, 88th percentile, 0.33 goals per game. That's a goal every 3 games, essentially. That's extremely good for a guy who's not in the lineup all that much. You're getting a ton of hits, 2.16 hits per game. That's 87th percentile in the league. Amongst forwards, that's even better. So you're getting an offensive forward, a goal-scoring hitter. This is kind of what you would look for in a guy like Tanner Jeannot a couple years ago. Tom Wilson fills that role a little bit in terms of hits and goal-scoring potential. But you also get the power play production, 81st percentile on the power play. He's usually in that bumper spot, and they work it between Backstrom or Kuznetsov, whoever's on that far side, and Oshie. And if it doesn't go to him, he touches it back to Ovechkin, and he scores. So he's going to get a ton of touches on the power play as long as he's healthy. And the other thing is extreme consistency. So 82, 77, 78, 75, 75, even when he's injured, when he's in the lineup, he's definitely going to perform well for you in a hits league. So if you're not in a hits league, he becomes less valuable, mainly because this plus minus is not great. His assist coverage isn't great. He does score goals, he gets power play points, and he does hit. So if you have those categories, if you're in a points league and those categories are heavily weighted, he could be a nice option for you. Last year, ADP 182, and if he's going there, again, I would take a flyer on him. I believe he's just a single position right winger. So, this is an opportunity to get a goal scoring right winger who hits deep in the draft, and that's why you would obviously target him. The cons, obviously injury risk, low point per game ceiling, only 0.60 points per game last season, minus 12 the previous season, and then minus 18 last year. So obviously if you have that category, you're not going to want him. But this is a guy who's going to fly under the radar because people forget about those older teams like Washington who have these guys on their team who are relatively consistent in their production, and people just don't want them because it's not the sexy name. It's not somebody on New Jersey or Buffalo or Ottawa. Those are the teams that are going to be targeted this year, and I think Oshie and guys like this are going to fly under the radar. Speaking of flying under the radar and the Washington Capitals, a guy you should want to own in any Bangers league, and that's Tom Wilson. He missed roughly the first 3 months of the season last year, recovering from a torn ACL. So once he returned to the ice in January, he played just 8 games before an ankle injury sidelined him. So he is 100% now. He's been working out all offseason. So everything should be good. And why you would own him, as I just mentioned with Oshie, goals and hits, 94th percentile in goals per game, 96th percentile in hits per game, almost 3 hits per game for Tom Wilson. And he just signed a massive contract, so that could be a money bag syndrome candidate in terms of, getting paid and maybe not performing well, but he's coming back from injury. So I would assume that he's very motivated to get back on the ice and get back to his game and his style of play. He does get a little bit of power play time, 0.15 power play points per game. The shots are decent, 2.5 shots per game as well. Gets some blocks, and his injury risk is not that high, so 89.91. He's usually healthy, so people were dogging him in the comments section on Twitter for being injured here and there and just signing a massive contract. But if you look at it, he's very consistent, 78, 81, 78, 79, 80. Because you're always getting those hits, you're getting goals, you're getting some peripherals. Obviously, if he just misses the net or hits the goaltender and somebody else puts it in, he's going to get a couple of assists. He had 13 goals, 22 points in 33 games last year. He was a minus 13 and only had 9 assists. So if you're looking for those 2 categories, you can kind of pass on him, but you're not going to want to pass on 97 hits in 33 games. The 13 goals, obviously. And then the last season that he was completely healthy, 24 goals, 52 points, plus 13, and 240 hits. So that's the obvious reason why you'd want to target Tom Wilson. And he's back and healthy now. So a lot of people are going to forget about him unless they've been playing fantasy hockey for a long time and understand how valuable he is in a Bangers categories league and in a league where you get like a point per hit or half a point per hit per game. he's going to give you a nice floor to that file. So not many assists, not as valuable in non-hits leagues, and his offense might depend on his usage with Spencer Carberry coming in and power play time. If he's going to get any power play time, that's going to help him. If not, that might hurt him a little bit, but you're still getting those hits and you're still getting that goal production. Now up at number 5, Val Nichushkin. I shouldn't have to tell you why you should own him. He was one of the top 5 best fantasy players last year before he got hurt. He missed a month after having ankle surgery. When he left, he was tied for their team lead in goals with 7 and 12 points in 7 games. And during that time, the Avs generated 3.5 goals per game when Nichushkin played, and then they averaged just about 3 goals per game in the 29 games without him. So he's incredibly valuable to that offense. And in terms of him specifically, why you'd want him, well, just look at this graph. Everything. You're getting points, goal production, assists, power play points, shots, even a couple hits, 1 hit per game, 0.7 blocks per game, but you're getting just under a point per game pace. You're getting a goal every 3 games, essentially half an assist, or an assist every other game, 0.3 power play points per game, and 3 shots per game. You're getting access to the top 6 in Colorado. He's either going to be playing with McKinnon or Rantanen. If a lot of people are out there thinking that Drouin's going to be on the top line with McKinnon, that may be the case for a little bit, but they like Nichushkin in that top 6, and he is an offensive driver on that team right now. The cons, he's not played more than 65 games in any of his last 4 seasons in Colorado, and he once went 50-plus games with no goals, and that was 18-19, which is why he's got this bottom number of 29. So I think that's in the past. That was 5 years ago by now. That was with Dallas. That was before coming over and getting the bump from the Colorado Avalanche offense. Since then, his floor is probably in the 50s, but over the past 2 seasons, he's been much, much better. High 70s, low 80s player, and that's where I would expect him to be this year. Now, last year, he was the 6th best left winger on my rankings, 36th skater overall, an 81 rating. So he's very complete, very prolific offensively. You're getting power play exposure in Colorado. I would assume that if it's between him and Lehkonen for that power play spot, they're going to give it to Nichushkin. And then obviously you're getting some shot volume, assists, goals, everything else. He was going ADP 143 last year. That's not going to happen this year. He's going to be much higher than that, probably 100 spots higher maybe. If you're looking at players that are, frequent fantasy players that had him last year or knew about him last year, he was very productive. So I would definitely target him after the 4th or 5th round as one of those guys, a left winger, goal scorer, shot volume guy, and even getting a couple of hits is nice as well. Speaking of goal scoring and hitting, you're going to want to have Evander Kane if he's available in a decent spot. So last year being drafted around the 60th mark, I would target him a little bit in that range, but I would hope to get him a little bit lower just because people forget about him. Kane has never played a full 82-game season, though he did play all 56 games of the shortened 2021 season. He got 22 goals, 49 points that year. Only 43 games in 21-22 and only 41 games last year. His injury risk is high, 77% of his team's games over the last 5 years. Last year, he had that deep cut to his wrist or forearm area, and he played through what seemed to be a torn MCL in the playoffs, and he was still productive. He scored a huge goal in that LA Kings series, and that was a gritty effort in my opinion. He was really gutting it out. And why you would own him: elite shot volume, 98th percentile, 3.56 shots per game. You're getting goal production, 93rd percentile, 3.39 goals per game, and then the hits, 3 hits per game is even better than Tom Wilson. So he's essentially Tom Wilson with more offense built in, and obviously you're getting exposure to McDavid and Draisaitl. Now, last year he was 16th in the NHL in shots per game. He was 19th in hits per game among forwards, and that's obviously why you're going to want to own him. The shots, the hits, and the goal scoring production. The assists are a little bit low. The power play production is not there, and that's one of the major cons. He gets almost no power play time. He doesn't usually factor in on that top unit. He's usually power play 2. He only had 2 power play points last year, only 4 in 21-22, and those are the 2 years that he's been in Edmonton. So significant injury history, and then on top of that, the no power play time. The assists are relatively low. Other than that, he's a very productive player in fantasy, especially in bangers leagues where you're going to want goal scoring and hits. Now, up next is another guy who is one injury away from ending it all. 2 back surgeries in under a year. He had a broken wrist during Game 5 of the finals, where he scored a hat trick, and had some other bumps and bruises along the way. He took that cross check from Jamie Benn. He had a hurt, and I don't know what happened with his jaw after that, but he definitely took some abuse in the playoffs. And if he needs another surgery on that back, that could be it for Mark Stone. But this is a quote from Mark Stone. "The crazy thing is that I felt pretty good during the season. It was an unfortunate incident, pretty minimal play that took me out for the remainder of the season, but I was feeling good most of the season, and I feel good now." So as of right now, he feels good. He thinks that he's going to be ready to go for camp. Obviously, there's the risk of injury because of the 75% of his team's games he's played over the last 5 years, and obviously what's gone on with his back. And then there is also the Stanley Cup hangover. But other than that, I think the injury risk would be the number one con. Obviously, this is a guy that's been extremely productive when he's in the lineup. He's been very consistent, even though he's been trending downward over the past couple of years as he's gotten injured. But his ceiling is in that low 80s range, 82, 81. Then he kind of dropped a little bit lower. This was a year he had his first back surgery, but even last year where he was injured for a little bit, he was a 74.31. That's really good. And why you would want to own him, you're pretty much getting all of these offensive categories from him. Points, goals, assists, shots, some power play, and shorthanded points. 9 power play points, 2 shorthanded points, 38 total points in 43 games, 94th percentile in goals, even better than the guys that we just talked about, .40 goals per game. The shot volume is really good, 2.63 shots per game. The power play production could even go up from there because of the fact that he might be healthier this year, and they'll rely on him for that. This is a guy that's typically been a really good fantasy player, and when he's healthy, he's over a point per game. So if you look at his last full season, 2021, 55 games played, 61 points, plus 26. So if you're looking in a plus-minus league, this is a guy that you want. 17 power play points that season, 21 goals, 40 assists. You're getting everything. So obviously the previous 3 guys that we looked at who got the goal scoring, they didn't get the assist numbers to match, but he does. So 21 goals, 40 assists that previous season. This last season, 17 goals, 21 assists. So even when he's hurt, he's still productive. He's still going to be able to do something for your fantasy team. Last year going around ADP 72, and if he can stay relatively healthy, if he's playing between 40 and 60 games this year, that's still probably a good place to get him because of how productive he is when he's in the lineup. You're going to have to account for the fact that he'll be put on IR, but that can open up a spot for you to play the waiver game and try to pick up somebody on a week-to-week basis while he's out. So this is definitely a guy you're going to want to own. I have him at number 3, but there are 2 players that are better than him in terms of what we're looking at in this video. And one of the best offensive players, the number 1 offensive player, is Philip Forsberg. He's another guy, hasn't played an 82-game season since 16-17. He's only played an 81.46% of his team's games over the last 5 years. Upper body injuries persist, but there's no indication of what those have been unless you have any info that I don't have. But why you would own him? Goals. So 93rd percentile last year. Shots, 95th percentile, 3.14 shots per game. Power play production, 0.26 power play points per game. The hits, 1.7 hits per game. So not as much as Tom Wilson or any of those guys, but you're getting about half of that with some better goal production. And then if you look at his last full season, or relatively full season, 69 games played, 42 goals, 42 assists, 84 points, plus 22, 27 power play points. He was 5th in goals per game that season. So incredibly productive. He was, I believe, the 4th highest rated player on the Data Draft Player Hub in 21-22, just because of how complete he is. He does a little bit of everything, including hits. The only thing he doesn't do is block a ton of shots, and that's probably for the best considering his injury history. Incredibly consistent, hovering around 79 all 3 of these seasons. He had an incredible season when all of the Nashville team had a really good offensive season in 21-22, but then it just came right back down to this average line, 79 last year. So you're pretty confident in what you're going to get out of Philip Forsberg. It might be frustrating not seeing him in the lineup, but if you're getting him around 56 and you have to account for 20 games or so where he's not in the lineup, I'll take that all day just because of the fact that he's this prolific in all of these other categories. So new coach, Andrew Brunette. that could potentially equal more offense. So in Florida in 2021, they were 5th in goals for per game, and they were 1st in 21-22. So they won the President's Trophy, and that was when Brunette was the head coach. Then Brunette goes to New Jersey. Before Brunette came over, they were 19th with 3.02 goals per game. After Brunette, they were 4th with 3.55 goals per game. So basically, when Brunette comes in, it's a half a goal per game increase. And if that tracks this year, Nashville will go from an abysmal 27th in the league, 2.79 goals per game, to around 3.3 goals per game, which would be roughly 15th. So if you can get that offensive bump from Andrew Brunette, it's probably going to go through Philip Forsberg, who is their main offensive weapon. High ceiling, he was, again, ranked number 4 on my rankings in 21-22 for completeness. The only cons here are the previously discussed anemic offense in Nashville. They're transitioning to younger players, and he does have a significant injury history. But again, this is one of those guys with an extremely high ceiling, probably along the same lines as Pacioretty, but less injury prone than Pacioretty. I don't think he's necessarily one injury away from ending his career. I could be wrong about that, but this is a guy I definitely want to target as a goal-scoring winger, which are obviously a little bit more valuable than some other positional players. And if you missed why that is, I have a number of videos on that. I'll link in the description below. But Philip Forsberg's definitely got my eye this year. I'm looking at him in that range, the 5th, 6th round range. But a guy that I had last year that I'm definitely going to be looking at this year, and he's probably flying under the radar, is John Carlson. He was the best player to target this year for fantasy value from an injury standpoint. Pretty significant margin as well. So his 5 years game played percentile, 96, which means he's not injured that much. It was just a freak injury last year. He took a slap shot to the head, but he doesn't have much of an injury history other than that. If you look at why you would own him, incredibly consistent, 80, 84, 82, 82, 83. So on top of all of that consistency, he was the number 5 best defenseman on my rankings last year and the 10th best player overall, as you can see right here, because of how complete he is. So he covers a little bit of everything. Elite shot volume, 3.1 shots per game. Elite shot blocker, 98th percentile in that category. He gets power play production, 92nd percentile there, 0.30 power play points per game. Goal scoring is still really good. He was consistently around 15 goals per season last year, 7th among D in goals per game. In 21-22, 6th. In 2021, he was 8th, and in 19-20, he was 8th. So he's always between 5th and 8th in terms of goals per game for defensemen. So you're getting goal production, shots, power play, blocks, a couple of hits. He gets about a hit per game, and you're getting the power play quarterback for Alex Ovechkin, and they're trying to set up Ovechkin to break Gretzky's record. So he's probably going to increase that assist total. He's at 88th percentile right now at half an assist per game. Overall consistency, as I just mentioned, never below an 80, never above an 84, but always in that range. And his overall positional rank over the last 5 seasons, 5th, 8th, 5th, 4th, and 11th. So he's one of the top 5 defensemen in fantasy in terms of covering all categories and being incredibly complete. It's just a matter of people forgot about him because he was injured and because people kind of get that narrative where he's a little bit older now, so is Washington. Do you really want to have him, or do you want to have Evan Bouchard or somebody new, up and coming? Mo Seider could be another guy that would get a little bit more attention, but I think that John Carlson, if you look at this track record, it's incredibly consistent, and you're looking at a guy that you can probably get in this range. Last year, I got him in the 5th round, and even though he got hurt, he was incredibly productive for my team while he was in the lineup. So this is definitely a guy I'm looking at this year as an elite D1. I would potentially take a little jump and get him before this if he's available, just because of what I just mentioned, his consistency, the lack of injury history, and all of the things that he could potentially cover for you. So that's it for the list. Let's take a look at the full list in detail with the scores. As I mentioned at the beginning, the list came together slowly, and I took those 4 categories we saw in the opening and I weighted them equally to generate a score that you can see over here on the left. The only discrepancy here is Tom Wilson and Nichushkin. I flipped them because I believe Nichushkin's slightly better, if not way better, than Tom Wilson in terms of offensive production. But because of Wilson's hitting and his overall 5-year rating, he was favored a little bit more by that weighted score. Obviously, some of these guys were missing data because they missed last season. And then over here is the table, how many categories they were above 90th percentile. You can see Mark Stone was one of those guys, Max Pacioretty was one of those guys, Nichushkin, one of those guys, and then the guys at the top, these guys had the highest 5-year average rating. That's how this is sorted. So Carlson coming in at number 1, pretty healthily above Philip Forsberg, about 2 points above. Tom Wilson was actually incredibly consistent over the last 5 years, as we mentioned. Evander Kane, if he didn't have that injury risk, he'd be a little bit higher. Oshie, he's another injury risk guy. Obviously, these are all injury risk guys, but we discussed how you should treat those guys in each individual file. But this one thing I didn't really realize until doing this exercise was that there's 4 Washington Capitals on this list, and that kind of tracks with what I usually like to do, which is to find value in players with less name value. So every year there are those sexy teams that have all the hype on them. This year it's probably Buffalo, Ottawa, maybe New Jersey, teams with a ton of up-and-coming young players, guys like Jack Hughes, etc. Guys who made a lot of moves in the offseason. Maybe you'd want access to DeBrincat in Detroit or whatever. So they have a lot of sexy on that name value, and then teams like this get overlooked. So if you go with the opposite approach and try to find a team like the Caps or the Pens, who should be better now that those 4 players are healthy, especially John Carlson, you could find some really good fantasy value. And then obviously thinking of those guys that missed time and missed almost the entire season last year. Guys like Couturier, guys like Atkinson, guys like Josh Norris. He's a huge sleeper that I'm looking at this year. If you can get him in the right spot in the draft, that could really put your team over the top. But that's going to do it for this one. This one dragged on a little bit, so if you watched the entire video, thank you for doing so. I know it was a long one, but we had a lot to cover. Hopefully you got some value out of this. Hopefully you found some targets for this year's fantasy draft. I'll be doing a bunch of different types of videos going forward into the draft season. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.